This presentation, I will focus on the study carried out prior to the conservation treatment of a copy of the Apocalipsis by Albrecht Dürer, stored at the house at the Istituto Centrale per la Grafica in Rome, from the Fondo Pio of the Istituto Centrale per la Grafica. And we're talking about a series of 15 prints from woodcuts produced by the German artist in 1498. As an illustration of the first Latin edition of the Apocalipsis con figuris. Over the centuries, the group of prints has undergone various historical stratification due to its passage through different collections and hands. And among those, the treatment of the lacune is the most significant category of traces left on this group of prints, and therefore the primary instrument to understand the history from a material and conservation perspective. So everything started in 2023 when I was lucky enough to be an intern at the Istituto Centrale per la Grafica, a wonderful place, and actually, in case you wonder, yeah, that's the window of the laboratory. It's a very incredible place, but the reason why I was lucky was because I could actually work within the institution through the departments, carrying out archival research, and also thanks to the cooperation with my former institution, the Istituto Centrale per la Patologia degli Archivi e del Libro, also carry out material analysis. So trying to put all the things together, all the pieces of the puzzle together. Well, why? Because, sorry. Yeah, let's go to the main topic. The interesting part is that this group of prints was showing traces of previous interventions. This separation was not clear at the beginning to us when we encountered the possibility of carrying out this project. But before going into the description of these layers, I will just quickly mention that the second intervention was revised during the third known intervention that was carried out in the 1994. However, in this last intervention, the first intervention was not revised. This was basically the start of everything, of our questions. Going backwards, the first layer of intervention consists of additions made in Browning manually to reconstruct the image, we could say, philologically. This treatment was not clear, the separation between this treatment and the other ones at the beginning. And to understand that, we actually had to connect again the prints, that were loose leaves at that point, to the volume from the collection of Nicola Pio, the collector who acquired these and other prints at the beginning of the 18th century. These prints were then put together in this volume that was dedicated to Dürer, and yeah, we could also find in the same volume on other prints similar intervention on prints that were never detached from the volume. And therefore we could, well, hypothesize that the hand was the same and likely was the person of Filippo Germisoni, the curator of Nicola Pio collection, and the person practically putting these prints together in the volume. What is interesting is that we have similar intervention throughout the whole 17th century, 18th century, but also with the development of the antiquities market, where the completeness of the image was a factor for the value of the objects. But we have information of similar treatments being performed until the 19th century. We have actually some information from Antonio Nicolini commenting in a critical way an intervention made at the Institute of Fine Arts in Naples, where he mentioned, well, I believe that restorers should refrain adding missing lines, but he mentions also only because this is something for very expert hands and should be done under the supervision of Professor Riccioni in this case. So it's interesting to see that this was still common. However, going forward, we could find more information in the original volumes. meaning the date in which, the reason and the date in which this series was detached from the original volume. So we're talking about an exhibition that took place in 1553. We have also the exact date in which the prints were detached, and also the name of the restorer, Luciano Bartolucci, who was at the time at the Institute. Why this is interesting? Because actually, we could find also other traces of all the information on this exhibition, communication of Petrucci, who was the director of the Institute at that time, and also a mention of the need of treatment for some of these prints that were exposed in this exhibition after the exhibition. And here we come to the second layer of the intervention. This is a very, very peculiar type of intervention. So basically, pieces of discarded prints were attached from the verso of the prints to face the presence of lacunas, mimetically, juxtaposed to mimetically hide these lacunas. This method was, again, not clear at the beginning, so we found the prints with still with some holes because the treatment that removed these fragments was left undone. These fragments were put in paper bags, indicating in each of these paper bags the inventory number of the prints from which they were coming from. But basically, this was left. This was frozen in time, and we could understand that these fragments were actually used in this way only because in a completely separate part of the Institute, I could find the images of how the prints were before the removal of this intervention. And so everything suddenly was connected again. You can see here more in the detail, this type of intervention. It's a very peculiar one, but I was still missing a piece. You can see here how, for instance, this fragment showing the roof of a house is used to mimetically infill a vest or one of the figure. But as I mentioned, I was still missing an element, so a description of this method, some traces. And in this essay by Bonarot, published in 1858, we have the exact description of this method. He mentions I believe that an amateur must have some fragments from skies and shadows variously cross-hatched, and they can be juxtaposed from the back to with this purpose. And this is exactly what we were looking at. So at this point, also I found another mention of this method in another manual, a later one from 1937. So this was still also employed in the 20th century, often 20th century. Also, material analysis were really important during the study because they helped us understand what happened and when. So likely the presence of the second group of lacuna was likely related to the exhibition that took place in the Villa Farnesina, close to the Tiber, a very warm and humid environment. And we can see traces of this mold on the verso of, in a specular way, on the verso on consecutive number of prints. So we can assume that this happened during the exhibition. After the exhibition, there was a need of intervening, and this was what happened. And we could find traces of microorganisms, likely causing these damages during the exhibition. We could also identify the glue, an animal-based glue used by Bartolucci during his restoration in the 50s, and likely perceived harmful by the restorers of the 90s that removed these fragments. We could also take a look with SEM analysis at the state of conservation of the fiber, which was showing chemical degradation. But this all this information were necessary, so to reconstruct the history of the object was absolutely necessary to develop the approach that we put in place to, or the decisions that we put in place during this treatment. And so the awareness of the importance of the historical stratification led us to the decision of reintroducing the Apocalypse 50s filling, developing a minimally invasive and easily reversible method specific for this case study. So some sort of drum-like repositioning based on the photographic documentation. This was the result of a discussion that aimed to put together history of conservation, conservation ethics, with a history of the object, planning a definitive treatment that could harmoniously express and keep the history of the object together. This was possible only after developing a theoretical framework also specific for this case study. This is not the first case of multiple revision, as of course you may all know these cases. The most interesting in this sense is, well, it's very similar to what happened in the case of the Apocalypse, the case of the Trionfo della Morte in Palermo. So in different moment of time, the perception changed and the decision changed. The Fondo Pio Apocalypse embodies three different approaches that can be seen as the perfect example of a cultural heritage bearing traces of the development of approaches in their history of conservation, so the philological, the mimetic, and the neutral approach. And as a result, the stratification were kept as evidence of all of the evolution of all these approaches and technical and applicative approaches developed throughout the history of conservation of work of art on paper, through 3 centuries in this case. So this consideration have allowed the series to be conceived as a unique piece despite its serial nature, and to preserve both its historical and artistic value. So I'd just like to thank all the people involved in the project, mainly my supervisors, and of course, all of you for your attention. Thank you so much.